Alrighty, guys, so we don't talk that much about The Flash on this YouTube channel, and there's a whole saga behind it. TLDR, basically, all the stuff that happened with Ezra Miller around the time of the Flash movie coming out. I decided at first I didn't want to watch the Flash movie at all, and I made a couple segments explaining why, because I didn't think Warner Brothers was taking enough accountability for, or not even accountability, just explaining themselves. And then, I thought about it some more and decided, you know what, we're just, at the very least, we're not going to cover the film on the channel, all that kind of stuff. Eventually, as you guys might have seen, we've been doing a DCE rewatch series, and eventually we will talk about the Flash, and I'll give more in-depth thoughts about it there. But anyways, we're not here to talk about the movie itself, and we're not here to talk about Ezra Miller. Kind of, not really, because here, this is interesting news. Earlier in the week, Andy Muschietti, the director of The Flash and supposedly the director of Brave and the Bold, he also directed the two It films, It and It Chapter 2, and he's also doing a bunch with the It TV series, It Welcome to Derry, and he was on some podcasts. And, normally I don't think these quotes are super interesting, but I feel like here, in his quotes here, because the question that was asked on some podcast or something like that, some podcaster show, he was asked why The Flash didn't do so well. And I read the comments. It's actually pretty short, honestly. Couple of short comments here from Andy Muschietti, but they're quite interesting. And I don't know if I agree with a lot of what he has to say. And we'll talk about why, and we'll talk about what the information that he has that I probably don't have, and why he might be able to explain himself a little more, and why I might just be talking, just to say things. But I think it's interesting still. Whether or not he knows a lot of data and he has a lot of analytics and stuff like that I don't, based on these comments, and I'm just, I might disagree with him, but I might also be completely wrong just because I don't have complete information, and none of us do. None of us have access to the kinds of analytical marketing and box office kind of data that Andy Muschietti did. So, all that to say, he gave a couple comments here. We're going to read these. It's more like one long quote, I think, on this radio show, but we'll read these out here. I'm looking at a Variety article. So this is what Andy Muschietti had to say about why The Flash failed. Quote, "The Flash failed, among all the other reasons, because it wasn't a movie that appealed to all four quadrants. It failed at that. When you spend $200 million making a movie, Warner Brothers wants to bring even your grandmother to the theaters." Okay, so that's the first part of the quote. And the second part of the quote here, I'm pulling it up, is he said, quote, "I found in private conversations that a lot of people just don't care about the Flash as a character, particularly the two female quadrants. All of that is just the wind going against the film, I've learned." Okay, this is what Andy Muschietti had to say about why the Flash failed in terms of, I don't know if he's talking so much about critical success. I think he's more talking about box office success. In fact, let me look up here how much the Flash made in its box office. I believe it was worldwide about $400 million, but I just want to double check here. No, I am way overshooting it. In 2023, The Flash grossed $271 million. $271 million. That is not a lot. That is less than Black Adam. That is less than Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. That's just a bit over Shazam 2 and just a bit over Blue Beetle. In fact, Blue Beetle, just out of curiosity, worldwide box office here, Blue Beetle made, let's take a look here, Blue Beetle made $130 million, and I think Shazam 2's made something like $180 million. And so, yeah, I mean, this was at the time when the DCE was dying. We'll talk about that in just a second. But let me go back to these quotes here. And I like to, because again, this is what people are saying. And I want to say, too, because I really like to analyze these quotes and go sentence by sentence, just so that everybody is clear. We're all on the same page. Because, I think a lot of times what we like to do is make generalizations, and we come to misunderstandings just because everyone's kind of interpreting these quotes in different ways. And so at the very least, even if you disagree with my interpretation, and again, I feel like it's pretty clear sometimes what these people are saying, and it's easy to get caught up in headlines. So that's why I really like to go sentence by sentence and just think about everything that they were saying, with the understanding, this is the caveat, that people, especially when they're just talking, when they're not giving written statements, are just talking. And sometimes they might say things that they're like, no, I actually didn't mean that. So for now, we're just taking this at face value. And then maybe later, these people, when we're reading the quotes and stuff like that, it might be like, no, I actually didn't really mean that. And they can explain what they actually meant later on. This is, but in a similar way to what we said about the Sony CEO and his comments about why he thinks critics killed the Sony Spider-Man universe, which they didn't. It was a ridiculous comment. I might have some disagreements here with Andy Muschietti. I don't think he's making ridiculous claims in that regard, but I do think that there are some interesting points here to talk about. So let's go back to the quote. Here, beginning with The Flash failed among all the other reasons. Okay, let's stop right there. Among all the other reasons, I think, is code for Ezra Miller and the DCEU. Point number one, just being Ezra Miller and doing crazy things and getting themselves in so much trouble by doing crazy things. Yeah, I think that had some impact, at least, on the Flash's box office performance. And I'm assuming here we're just limiting the conversation to box office performance. So definitely, he's right. That is one major headwind going against the film. And the other one, like I mentioned, the DCEU was dying. It was dying. Aquaman 1 made $1 billion, and it was fun. And while I think Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom is maybe not as good, I still think it was fun. And the critics, I think liked it about as much as they did with Aquaman 1. It wasn't like a 10% Rotten Tomatoes film. I believe it was like 40% or something like that. And the first one was like 50, 60%. So it's, people generally like the film, and it made half of what the first one made. Like I mentioned, Shazam 2 in 2023 made $180 million or so. Flash made $270 million. Blue Beetle made $130. The DCEU was dying. It was dying. It's starting from Black Adam in the previous year, 2022, made like $350 million. DCEU was dying. So yeah, those are two. I completely agree with Andy Muschietti there when he talks about the other reasons. There were major headwinds going against The Flash. Let's continue though. The Flash failed among all the other reasons because it wasn't a movie that appealed to all four quadrants. Now, four quadrants. For a film to be four quadrants, and I don't know who made up this metric. I don't even know if people use this anymore in film, but what Andy Muschietti is referring to is a four-quadrant film appeals to four very distinct sectors of people, and allegedly, again, I don't know how legitimate this is anymore of a metric to use, but what he's referring to is that there are four quadrants, two being male, two being female, and one each being over and under 25 years old. That's what I saw, at least. If I'm looking at something completely different, let me know in the comments, but that's at least my understanding. But generally, even if you don't want to know the details or the specifics of a four-quadrant film, what you need to know is that the four-quadrant films are basically the ones that appeal to everyone. So, generally the ones that make the most money, like Avengers and even Pixar films are, four-quadrant films. They generally appeal to everybody. But you're talking about your Avengers films and, even Batman films sometimes, although, some of them are a little bit violent. But Deadpool and Wolverine, for example, probably not a four-quadrant film. In fact, definitely not a four-quadrant film just because it can't really appeal to younger audiences. So that's an example of what he's talking about. Because it wasn't a film, he's saying, that appealed to all four quadrants. It failed at that. I want to continue before I do a little bit more analysis. But he said, when you spend $200 million making a movie, Warner Brothers wants to bring even your grandma to the theaters. Again, I don't doubt that. I don't doubt that when they're putting that much investment into the movie, they want everyone to come to the theaters. I would argue, and I'm not saying that he's incorrect, that his perception of this idea is wrong, because maybe Warner Brothers has a different philosophy than Disney. However, I would say in general, in fact, even Warner Brothers has been, known to do this. They put a lot of money into films they know are not going to be four-quadrant films. Joker, for example, a lot of money into those films. Not four-quadrant films, in the slightest. I would even argue The Batman is probably not a four-quadrant film. Right? And similarly with, like I just mentioned with Disney, Deadpool and Wolverine, not a four-quadrant film. They spent a lot of money on those movies. So superficially, I don't think that's actually true. I don't think that just because they spend a lot of money on you, they want you to bring every single quadrant to the movies. Rather, I think what a more correct interpretation of that is that when they spend a lot of money on your movie, $200 million, for example, it means that however they can get that investment back, a return on investment and profit, they want to get it. And if that means, appealing massively to a certain demographic that your film is appealing to, then yeah, that's what that means. Now, I do think Flash was being positioned as one of those four-quadrant comic book movies that almost anybody could watch, kids, adults, even your grandma, I suppose, if she really wanted to watch The Flash. And so I do think in that sense, maybe Andy Muschietti is more speaking about his film in particular. Like, look, when Warner Brothers puts $200 million into a film like Flash, they want to bring even your grandmother to the theaters. I just want to point out, though, I don't think that's universally true. Like I said, for Joker, right, they wanted a very specific, and they wanted adults, right? And by specific, I just mean adults. They wanted adults to come. And people who are big, Batman fans, or even people who are Oscar film fans for Joker 2 because they saw the first film and they were like, oh, Oscar won an Oscar. There's a very specific set of demographics that they wanted for Joker 2. not necessarily, your grandmother. I don't think they really cared that if your grandmother went to Joker 2. Just wanted to point that out. But we'll get back to the fact that it wasn't a four-quadrant film after I read the rest of the quote again, because I think it ties more into the second part of his quote. So he said, again, quote, "I found in private conversations that a lot of people just don't care about the Flash as a character, particularly the two female quadrants. All of that is just the wind going against the film, I've learned." Okay, here's the thing. Here's the interesting thing about that. I don't doubt, like I prefaced earlier, I don't doubt that Andy Muschietti was told or looked at data, accurate data, from surveys and polls and marketing and whatnot, from who watched the trailers and all these kinds of things, and exit polls and whatnot. I'm sure Andy Muschietti was looking at numbers that were correct, quote unquote, for these surveys, that showed that, yeah, the female demographics were not particularly interested in the Flash. And that is what it is. I mean, I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing, but Flash was just not a film, I guess, according to their data, that appealed to all four quadrants, because apparently it wasn't getting the female demographic. Okay, it is what it is. However, like I just said, I don't think a film needs to be a four-quadrant film to make a lot of money and to be successful. And I want to focus in on the second part of this quote here. "I found in private conversations that a lot of people just don't care about Flash as a character." And the implication going to the last sentence here, all of that is just the wind going against the film, I've learned. This is actually the sentence I take the most issue with. Because again, and I say this, not to equate what Andy Muschietti is saying about the Flash and what Tom Vinciquerra, who is the Sony CEO, said about the fact that critics hated critics intentionally destroyed their Sony Spider-Man universe because they just hated these characters. But no, I mean, and I made this example in that video, that's why I'm talking about it here. If Sony made a film, right? If Sony made a film, that was beloved, like critically beloved. Sure, maybe at first, if it was coming off of the heels of a Craven and Madam Web and Morbius, then it wouldn't make a ton of money, but it would make enough money to then say, okay, let's make a sequel. And I would argue that building on that positive momentum, it does not matter who that character is. It doesn't matter who that character is. You can make as much money as you want as long as you have, quote unquote, good product. Now, I'm not saying Flash, quote unquote, failed because it was a bad movie. I personally didn't love the movie, but enough people did. It had something like a 60% on Rotten Tomatoes, 60 or 70%. People seem to generally like the movie. And again, I would point, if I were Andy Muschietti, not to the fact that it wasn't a four-quadrant movie, but just the fact that there are other mitigating factors going against it. Ezra Miller and the DCEU. I would say that's more than enough to explain why the film didn't make a lot of money. Instead, this whole thing about people just don't care about the Flash character, arguably the Flash is one of the most prominent DC characters, boosted especially by the TV show, that had just come out, that was pretty successful, at least for CW standards. And I point to the fact that you can make comic book movie films about any kind of character, as obscure character as you want, and those films will make money if they're good and if the general momentum is in a positive direction. The Suicide Squad, maybe that's a bad example, because the Suicide Squad was coming out during the pandemic, but even the first Suicide Squad was a, critically panned movie, made $800 million. So, and do you think that people really cared about Deadshot, beforehand? I mean, maybe they were interested in Jared Leto's Joker, but I mean, these are not characters that people generally care about. Guardians of the Galaxy. Do you think people cared about Star-Lord as a character beforehand? No, I don't think. I think if you did these same kinds of polls, that you'd find people be like, I don't even know who Star-Lord is, right? That film made $750 million. There are plenty of other examples. Shang-Chi, people didn't know who Shang-Chi was before they made the film. And again, I think this idea of people just don't care. Actually, the most prominent example, going back to the Sony universe, Venom. I know Venom's a quote-unquote cool character, but we're not just talking about the people in the comic book circles, because I know people in the comic book circles, myself included, think Venom is a very cool character. But you go outside of that to the general movie-going audience, which is what he's talking about. He's talking about the four quadrants. These are people, general movie-going audiences. And you ask them, hey, are you interested in a Venom movie? I would guarantee the reaction would be maybe even more negative than Flash. People would be like, what? Why? Why are you making this Venom movie? Is Spider-Man in it? No. Then why would I care? But the movie made $800 million. Point being, I just don't understand this whole logic about people just didn't care about Flash as a character until my movie failed. There are legitimate reasons outside of the film. Because again, if the movie was, had a like 20% better critical rating, would it have made a little bit more money? Maybe. If it was a 20% less, critical rating, would it have made a little less money? Sure. But I mean, just from my perspective, Andy Muschietti has other very legitimate reasons as to why The Flash did not make money. Again, I think primarily Ezra Miller and the DCEU, and I think he's pointing at the wrong reasons here, honestly. Now, I don't have the full context for this. I'm just looking at the Variety article, so maybe he explains himself a little bit more on this radio show. Again, I'm just looking at this Variety article that has these quotes here. But I found it interesting because, again, I really like to kind of go in depth here and dissect and just think about, like, why do people say what they say? What's the motivation? And are there other explanations for it? And I think that Andy Muschietti's comments, I think that there are other explanations for what he is trying to describe here. But I ask you guys, what do you think about Muschietti's comments? Do you think that they make sense, or do you think that there were other reasons why The Flash failed other than the fact that it just wasn't an appealing kind of character, an appealing kind of film? Let me know in the comments down below.